So the permafrost carbon network, this first slide is showing you the motivation for it, and really it's a synthesis network. And can someone remind me on WebEx, can you see my actual mouse moving around, or do I need to click on something?
No, we can see it.
Okay, great, thanks. So the motivation for putting the network together had to do with sort of the explosion of peer-reviewed publications on the topic of permafrost carbon. In the upper left-hand side is showing number of publications by year, and so since the 2000s we've had a real interest and sort of discovery really of the size of the permafrost carbon pool and its potential impact on climate. And so we made the argument to NSF RCN program, the Research Coordination Network program, that there was a lot of new primary information, but really to understand it we had to bring it together in synthesis, and so we set up the Permafrost Carbon Network in order to do that. This network is organized into a number of working groups that are addressing different aspects of this, so people focusing on the quantity, the amount of carbon, organic carbon stored in frozen ground, what we call the quality, or how fast that carbon can decompose when it's exposed to microbial decay, and then issues of the environment such as aerobic, anaerobic conditions that affect carbon dioxide versus methane release that are also very important in terms of determining the climate feedback. And then landscape effects like something called Thermokarst, which is thawing of frozen ground that happens much faster than just temperature increase. And then lastly, we have a modeling integration working group that's both doing a modeling intercomparison and working with the other 4 working groups. So this network is built up over time. We have a couple hundred members distributed internationally at a number of different institutions. So a key theme of this network is we have a very focused science question, and that really is asking how the store of frozen carbon in the Arctic can feed back to climate change. And so in order to understand that, you can pose a simple question of asking what is the magnitude, timing, and form of permafrost carbon that's released to the atmosphere as the climate changes. And so the essence is we need to quantify how much organic carbon is stored frozen now, but importantly, how much of that can end up in the atmosphere, how fast is that going to happen on decades to centuries, and then the form, meaning whether we're ending up with the greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, or methane, or what the balance of those two are. So if you know those 3 factors, then you can sort of predict or project, I should say, the impact of changing Arctic on the global carbon cycle and then future climate change. So that science question, of course, is easy to pose at the largest scale. It's made up of many sub-questions, and so what the network is trying to do is bring together really the latest information, and through research synthesis, put together sort of a clear picture of what we understand the role of permafrost carbon to be in terms of driving current and future climate change. So the way this network is structured is that we've been holding workshops every 6 months. So we have a series of meetings and working groups that bring together people in person and extend this network. One of these workshops occurs the day before AGU. We'll be holding one upcoming on December 13th, I think that is, and that's an open science meeting showing current work to date and including people that might be coming to AGU and might be interested in the network. Then 6 months after the AGU date, we typically hold another workshop that is smaller. It's made up of members who are actually putting together synthesis products. It's about 20 to 25 people. We use that to push forward the synthesis products that we're working on. So beyond these couple workshops, we are building up a larger network of researchers that are interested in this topic, and we've put a lot of this information on the website, which is shown here. And then we're also in training younger researchers in the synthesis activity as an active part of how we do the synthesis. And I'll show a slide on that in just 1 second. So those are overall activities that kind of speak to the objective listed at the top here. Just to give you a little timeline of where we've come from, so the original funding starting in 2011 let us kick off a meeting in Seattle where it was really an all-scientists meeting to put together sort of the structure and the working groups and kind of the focal synthesis products that we were interested in. And that's been followed up by these semi-annual meetings that have occurred, I guess, really in different places depending on who has been hosting them. As I mentioned, we've also been holding the open science meetings at AGU, which have been a way that this network has continued to expand. The last two, I guess I'm showing, we just had a meeting here in Flagstaff in May that produced another round of scoping papers, and then we're in the midst of planning for the meeting at AGU in December. We do also a lot of outreach on this topic, and so I've listed meetings up at the top where we've been presenting information from the Permafrost Carbon Network, and this really has involved many of the lead people either giving presentations themselves or myself or the lead research scientist on the project. Shadle has given presentations as well, so we're doing outreach in terms of trying to get the science information both to other scientists and then also to more broad communities of people working on the topic of climate change from a big perspective. Okay, this next slide is just highlighting some of the science products. So our main goal, besides networking, is actually producing synthesis science. We've had pretty good success there. We started off with a comment article from our very first workshop kind of outlining what the feedback was from Frost Carbon to Climate. That was out of our all-scientist meeting. And then over time we've been able to add synthesis papers that are peer-reviewed, published in journals that bring together data, observations, and model results together. And so there's been a number of them. I kind of list them by year here. They're led by various people. It's basically a grassroots effort, so people aren't being paid to do a particular synthesis products, but we use these workshops to let topics bubble up and be discussed, and the ones that have the most energy and enthusiasm and that can be followed are the ones that have turned into databases. So most of these publications are synthesizing the primary literature, and also we are kind of collecting that and posting those databases when appropriate. So there's 2014, so that's what we've been doing in the past 4 years, and then brought it together more recently in a new review paper that was just published in April that really sort of laid out the activities of the different working groups and what the progress was to date in terms of our understanding of the overall question of frost carbon and climate change feedbacks. So if you're interested in these particular publications, you can go back to the website. They are there, and you can read them in detail. As I mentioned, we brought together this review paper, and so the authors here are essentially people that led individual synthesis products. As through these workshops, we took the information from individual synthesis papers and wrote this synthesis of syntheses, so essentially tried to bring everything together in sort of a state-of-the-art bottom line, and again, that was published in April. And I don't have time to go through all of the results of this today, but I will say sort of the bottom line of what our group thinks at the moment is that if you look at the stores of frozen carbon in the Arctic, which we estimate to be just under about 1,600 billion tons, we think that the vulnerable fraction, so thinking about what could end up in the atmosphere in a business-as-usual climate scenario, is about 5 to 15% of that pool by the year 2100. Now, so that fraction, if you take the midpoint, 10% of that number, if you multiply that back by the known permafrost pool, it's about 100 to 150 billion tons of additional carbon coming out of the Arctic as a result of anthropogenic climate change. And so putting that into perspective, it's an important additional source of new carbon to the atmosphere. It's similar to biospheric sources like land use change. If you look backwards at like forestation, permafrost emissions would be on a similar that. Contrast, it's less than what we project from fossil fuel emissions in the future. So it's not a source that makes human emissions irrelevant. In fact, it's just an addition to human-driven climate change and will cause climate change essentially go faster than we think on estimates from human sources alone. So that's kind of the take-home message of that review. As I mentioned, aspect of the network that's particularly important is early career scientists. So what I show here are essentially people that were postdocs during the initial period of our network. They all led synthesis papers. They were usually paired with senior scientists in these working groups. So senior scientists brought other networks, brought data. Early career scientists brought energy and the determination to finish something quickly. So all of these people essentially published a synthesis paper. They've all either moved on to get positions of their own or to get either a fellowship or funding on this topic of permafrost research. So there's been a bunch of energy generated from that, and there's a little slot, I guess, asking if you want to be one of these people. And so I don't know how many early career scientists are on this call, but it's a place for you here. This is just, like I mentioned, a real snapshot of our activities. You can go to our website, permafrostcarbon.org. That's sort of a central warehouse for what we've been doing. It lists all of our people. Importantly, you can go into each of these workshops that we've been doing and find the presentations. And so if you want sort of the latest and greatest information, even before publication, do post it here at this website. You have to register to be a member of the Permafrost Carbon Network to access the presentations. That way you can list yourself as a potential participant of the synthesis, but then you can also look at what's being done there as well. I'll just kind of put that out there as a place to get more information. And it's a little bit of an old slide. It says AGU session 2014, but if you go to the actual website, we would be listing our 2015 activities. Okay, and so that sort of brings us up to present day. I wanted to mention the funding from the Research Coordination Network program came to its end, and then thanks to the SEARCH program, Study of Environmental Arctic Change, office, which is an ongoing project, but it was at a new cycle. In its programmatic scheme, having what it's called here action teams, and so within the broader SEARCH umbrella, which is thinking about the Arctic system as a whole and trying to connect science and users, action teams that were formed to address three kind of big Arctic issues of the current moment, and listed here. I'm leading the Permafrost Action Team along with Christina Shadle. We have the Sea Ice Action Team, Jennifer Francis, Henry Huntington, and then the Land Ice Action Team, Diana Stranos and Ted Scambos. And the exciting thing here for our Permafrost Carbon Network, we're sort of one element within the Permafrost Action Team. The Action Team itself has a much broader agenda, thinking about degrading permafrost and its impact both on ecosystems and carbon, but also wildlife, fisheries, and then ultimately humans and society. And so really what I'm talking about today, the Permafrost Carbon Network, is one smaller aspect of this broader umbrella. Search had a kickoff meeting 1 year ago today almost, really connecting across these action teams, trying to put knowledge action as sort of a main central theme. That's something that we've been doing in our carbon network, and then we're continuing to do as part of this broader search permafrost action team. So that's just a little context for how the permafrost carbon network itself is moving forward, and then also just to get you thinking broadly about frost topics as a whole that will also be falling under this umbrella. Okay, so this is my slide here of milestone, and I think before we sort of go into this next section, I'd be happy to take any specific questions about the Permafrost Carbon Network or the Permafrost Action Team.
Any questions for Ted? I might have a couple of questions, but I think they're related to the milestones. So I'm going to wait on those to see what you have to say.
So this is Simon. So I have a question. It's I think you said this, but I can't remember. Just maybe it's clarification. So has the RCN funding ended, but the search funding picks up where the RCN funding ended?
Yeah, that's the story. So the RCN was coming to an end of its project period, and then search funding started right when that ended.
And the search funding has a broader scope than what was the scope of the RCN originally, is that?
Yeah, and that's on two levels, which is, I mean, there's people on this call that could speak more broadly to the search program, which is a much broader.
I'm sorry. To be clear, the search funding that's assigned to your action team.
Oh yes. Okay. Yeah. So more narrowly thinking about the one action team. Yeah, and I did drop out a couple of slides that kind of went into the detail about the action team. But the action team specifically is about changing permafrost. So carbon is one element, but not the only element of that. And so our main aim through search funding is to tackle sort of additional permafrost-related questions, also in the same way through science synthesis, but trying to use science synthesis to connect to outreach. So you'll see over the upcoming period that hopefully what we've done here with Permafrost Carbon Network, we're also going to try to apply this approach to other topics relating to changing permafrost as well. Okay, so you would imagine that in, I don't know, 3 years' time, you would be extending those graphs that you showed where you were doing, you know, both meetings and synthesis products, not only on the permafrost carbon issue, but these other issues. But you see the model that you were using, and it appears to be pretty successful, that continuing into the next 2 or 3 years. Yeah, that's exactly right. So you could imagine the same kind of model and then apply it to different topics. So, you know, for example, a topic of great interest but unrelated to carbon would, how does changing frost affect infrastructure? Can we synthesize that and get sort of a picture across the Pan-Arctic? I mean, that's also a, you know, big question. Lots would go into that, but you could imagine using the same approach to tackle that as a science question as well. So we're right in the process of sort of developing next extensions beyond carbon, but we're hoping to use the same process and the same timeline into the future on that.
Great, thanks. That's very helpful.
Sure.
Yeah, this is Carl. I guess I have sort of a question, and I guess I'm going to formulate as I'm asking it, but as you're probably aware that we have 2 other milestones that are new that have to do with the circumboreal vegetation map, that we actually have a map produced now for Alaska and Northwest Canadian boreal areas. And I guess my question is, have you looked at soil region as far as vegetation types and looked at your permafrost or your carbon stores, and then sort of taken those and provided some estimates of carbon input into the Arctic Ocean?
Yeah, so, okay, Carl, that's a good question, and I think what I would say there is two things, which is next few slides we're going to look at some maps that are synthesis products of the permafrost carbon network, and you're going to get an idea that sort of the domain that we're looking at, the northern circumpolar permafrost zone, is kind of a combination of Arctic and boreal biome. There's a little bit of a disconnect depending on if you're talking strictly about biomes or talking about permafrost. So you'll see those maps, and I think you'll get a better idea of our domain that we're talking about. Specifically, sort of ended the question thinking about lateral transport of carbon to the Arctic Ocean, and that is one of the topics that's being considered by one of the working groups. So we've been thinking about dissolved carbon and thinking about its lability and its transport. We haven't, when we've done the global scale analysis that I sort of gave you as a summary of Nature Review, that does not include lateral transport. And so these biggest models, the Earth system models that are simulating carbon and climate at the largest scales, aren't moving carbon in that way, but we do have sort of smaller synthesis efforts trying to understand how much of this carbon ends up in aquatic systems, ultimately in the ocean.
Okay. And I guess my only other question is, based on what you've shown us, that to me, I sort of get the sense that a lot of the work that you've already done already feeds into these two items with this milestone.
Yeah, and you know, if this could be a good segue, which is, yeah, this milestone it's fortuitous because the next 6 slides I'm going to show, hopefully, they're either published or works in progress on both 1 and 2. And so if we're ready to keep going, I can just show you what exists to date and then what might be a way to forward on.
Okay. Yeah, why don't you go ahead since it's almost a half hour into the... Okay.
Yeah, and I can go fairly quickly through this and have more time for discussion if that's the way we want to do this. And so essentially what I did in this next section, so the last slides were sort of an overview of how that whole network was working and what it produced in general. I wanted to kind of show you specifically what we've produced thinking about these 2 questions. So what are the gaps, our understanding in the magnitude distribution of permafrost carbon? So I guess that's the stuff that's frozen, and thinking about what fraction of that is vulnerable, and do we know spatially where that is? So that's how I interpreted identifying the areas of permafrost. So these, of course, are topics and questions that we've been beating our heads against in this network for a while, so we do have some things to report. I'm showing you first the sort of latest and greatest stock estimates. And so this first slide is showing the surface 0 to 3 meters of terrestrial soils, and it's showing you the carbon density, which is all the colors, and then it's showing you kind of sampling locations. I guess the carbon density is extrapolated across Arctic, the cross zone, and then black dots are showing you specifically where we have sampling locations down to 3 meters. So there's a lot more information at the surface meter, but the sort of deeper deposits are where data lack. And so in this new inventory of the surface, I just show a few factoids here. We think there's 1,000 gigatons or petagrams, 1,000 billion tons of organic carbon stored here, and if you think about global soils everywhere down to 3 meters, that's 33% of that pool, if you count this estimate within that. And this synthesis, which was published by Zafigailius last year is an update to Charles Tarnakai's initial stock estimate, but through synthesis, through the action of the network, we were able to increase the inventory of 0 to 2 meter and 0 to 3 meters almost by an order of magnitude, with a lot more data on these deep soils that previously shown to have carbon, but now we've added a lot more to our database. And really that's supporting the same story that there's a lot of carbon down deeper past the surface meter than previously recognized. So that's the latest picture, and this database is available. It's posted at the Earth Systems Pangea database that's hosted in AVI. Excuse me, the next slide is showing carbon that's stored deeper than 3 meters. So the deeper you go, the less data, the fewer data available, and so we're piecing together maps of what's called Yedema, these glacial deposits both in Siberia and Alaska. New understanding has revised the stock here, so now that the Yedema region, which is outlined in yellow, has gone through various freeze-thaw processes, particularly as conditions became warmer after the last glacial maximum. Red is showing you areas that probably never thawed since the Ice Age, and yet the in-between areas have gone through some cycle where it may have been thawed by a lake and then refrozen into permafrost. So there's been a lot of new work kind of really getting at the details of that. There's other areas shown in hatched black here are deep sediments that are outside this Yedema region that we actually have very little information about, that they seem to, from very limited boreholes, they do contain organic carbon, but we don't really have much of an inventory of that. These numbers here just kind of summarize where the new inventory was relative to the thinking in Tarnakai's work. Yedema region, there's still some uncertainty there, so we have 2 new estimates that vary by a factor of 2, so 2 to 400 billion tons. So even, this is one of these cases where we did a lot of additional synthesis, but we actually didn't converge on a single answer, so there's still science questions out there. Arctic deltas, which are marked in green, contain a lot of carbon, but less than Charles Tarnakai reported from initial data, and then other deposits, hatched regions that I just mentioned that weren't included at all in the Tarnakai that could have a couple hundred. So I put a question mark there because we don't even add them into our final deposits. We can't really quantify them at this scale yet. And then the same for undersea permafrost. So there's a whole amount of carbon underneath the shelves, and it was exposed during the last ice age. Now it's under the ocean. It's slowly degrading, and again with an unknown reservoir of carbon there. So at the very bottom, I just added up and say the known permafrost carbon, which is the surface to 3 meters plus deeper deposits, are anywhere between 1330 and 1580 billion tons. That's not including those 2 question mark ones on the bottom of the slides. So we've made a lot of progress through synthesis. It's a remote region that's undersampled, so there are still places that people need to go, but hopefully this work kind of puts that out. Okay, so that's getting at stocks, and so now let's shift a little bit to the vulnerability. So how fast could these stocks change, and could they end up in the atmosphere as greenhouse gases? I'm going to just sort of skim through different approaches that we've been undertaking to that question, and then that'll kind of show you where we are to date on that. But the first approach is essentially using Earth system models or large regional models to do a dynamic model simulation of carbon stocks now and then into the future. And so this is modeling integration work group led by Dave McGuire, who was my co-PI, both on the RCN and then as part of SEARCH, and then also Lawrence and Charlie Coven. And this shows you the domain that they're working with, the colored regions, which is mostly overlapping the map that I showed you before. And they're modeling the retrospective change, so asking the question of what happened to the permafrost carbon pool from 1960 to 2010, and then what's going to happen in the future with these different RCP scenarios. And this is a model intercomparison, so they've gotten 15 models to deliver data on the retrospective, 8 for the future forecasting. And the results for that are in. I'll show you that, but that essentially gives you a spatial map of where we think the carbon is and how it will change into the future. And so that's all based on this dynamic modeling. There's a whole number of diagnostic papers that have used this model output to look at individual factors. I kind of list them at the bottom, but I won't go into detail. But there's about 8 other papers that are coming on looking at the output of this MIP activity. This slide, I unfortunately couldn't find a map, but those global models are giving a spatial representation of the permafrost carbon pools. I'll show one map in a few slides, but these are kind of the results. And the top 2 panels are showing change in permafrost area time. I kind of cut out the x-axis, but it's under 2 warming scenarios. So RCP 4.5, which is kind of the mid-warming, and then RCP 8.5, which is the business as usual warming. So they're all models project large decreases in permafrost, and of course it's more when the climate is warming faster. And then that change in permafrost region then feeds into these carbon cycle models. So these little budgets on the bottom show you changes in the vegetation and the permafrost carbon response to these processes like activity or NP, fire losses, and methane. So these are all accounted for in these large models. So this is manuscripts in draft, unpublished. These would contain maps of what the models are showing. So we know this MIP was done, and we know that the models don't fully represent the permafrost zone very well, but we still thought doing a MIP where you are giving constant drivers to the models can do about. Okay, so that's using just a dynamic model. I'm going to try to speed it up a little bit here. There's another effort led by Charlie Coven. It's just coming out next month in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, where we sort of combined model results with data results. So the previous slide was just using model world to project vulnerable carbon. This approach took the actual carbon inventory that I show in this map, and then it combined it with the syntheses that we did. So this is carbon with depth here. So we took the carbon spatially and by depth, about how decomposable that carbon is as measured by laboratory incubations, another synthesis product out of the RCN. Took information on how that carbon behaves, whether it's getting oxygen and giving off CO2, or whether it's having no oxygen and decomposing where it's saying anaerobic carbon dioxide and methane. And then we coupled all those data observations from synthesis with the same global model projections of temperature. So instead of letting the models run the whole carbon cycle here, we just let them simulate the temperature fields both in the air and in the permafrost, and then we use the data constraints to give a projection of how much carbon was lost. And that again produces these kind of spatial estimates of carbon loss under these 2 scenarios. So again, the top is RCP 4.5, bottom is the business as usual, and it's showing you the fraction of carbon that's lost in different regions, these warming scenarios out to the year 2100. So again, this is exactly, this is a spatial estimate of how much and where the vulnerable carbon is. Okay, so that was we covered dynamic models. This is data constrained models. The third approach I wanted to mention here was, and I haven't yet talked about, but it's talked about in our review paper, but know that changes in the permafrost zone are not likely just to be the fact that temperature is 2 degrees or 4 degrees or 6 degrees higher. We know that there are landscape processes that happen. In particular, when you thaw ice-rich ground, the ground subsides or hill slopes actually fall apart in a process we call Thermokarst. And in the paper we call it abrupt thaw because essentially you can thaw a lot more frozen ground more quickly than you would guess just from temperature alone. The reason I haven't mentioned it until now is that all those large-scale models, they are just looking at temperature increases in the air, as it would propagate into the ground. So if your air rises 6 degrees C, then it takes a certain amount of time before it's 6 degrees C warmer at 2 meters. But they completely ignore these landscape processes that cause frozen ground to thaw much more rapidly. And on the left-hand side, there's some features that are shown that result from these thermokarst processes. So you can get wetland formation as the ground subsides and collects water, and then in extreme cases that will even give you a lake if there's enough water to submerge the terrestrial system. And then you're also getting this process on hill slopes where you have hill slope failure and other geomorphologic processes. The bottom line is that most of these processes seem to speed up the degradation of permafrost thaw faster than from a temperature-based model. So we spent a lot of time making the map, and the colored map on the right is trying to break down the landscape into its vulnerability to these abrupt thaw processes. I won't go through all of the categories, but essentially we use these landscape attributes to divide landscape into places that are more or less susceptible to these different types of abrupt thaw. This is work conducted by Dave Ohlefeld, who started as a postdoctoral researcher associated with the Carbon Network and is now has a position in Canada working on this. So we combine this sort of estimate of where you might have this abrupt thaw occurring and then overlay it with where the carbon was. And so this, again, is a paper that's either about to be submitted or has been submitted, but we're essentially coming up again with these vulnerability maps. This isn't specifically to changing temperature, but it's overlaying where the carbon is, where we think climate change is going to be the most extreme with this susceptibility to these abrupt thaw thermokarst processes. Another sort of spatial representation of that. Okay, and I know I've talked a lot. I'm just going to show 2 more things, but probably not dwell on it and go right to discussion. The other thing that we've been doing is trying to both make these spatially explicit maps showing what we think the current vulnerability is, but we also are trying to highlight where the data are coming from. And so there's a map here called the Permafrost Regionalization Map where we're trying to break down the places data. So that's what this map is based on. And if you go into the website, which I'm showing in these last couple of slides, we've taken all of our synthesis information, we've plotted it in Google Earth, and you can look at maps of where the data points come from. And so this kind of brings these extrapolations back to some reality in terms of saying, okay, here's what we think is a picture for the circumpolar permafrost zone, but here's where the actual data are collected. So all of our synthesis products have these Google Maps. If you click into any one of them, this is showing you, all the locations where people have done an incubation of this organic carbon. And you can see it's a handful of sites compared to the area, and you can click on any site and you can actually drill down into the data that's available behind it. So this is sort of a little bit of a gap analysis that we've just put onto the website, and we haven't actually published it separately, but it's kind of illustrating kind of where the data gaps are, as well as kind of the scaled information that I was showing you earlier. Okay, so that was a whirlwind of things that are essentially underway that I thought spoke to the milestones, and I think I'm going to just rest right there, Carl, so we don't run out of time for discussion here. Hopefully I haven't taken too much.
No, that was really good, and I guess my first impression is that, and maybe I'm really wrong, but it looks like you've already done a lot of the work for this milestone. It looks like a lot of it's already been completed.
Yeah, I mean, as a scientist, I always see the 3 steps ahead, so I hate to say that it's completely finished, but I think we've progressed a lot on addressing the milestone. I guess we didn't set out with your milestone in mind, but looking at this work, I think it does address how that milestone is laid out.
Yeah. Any questions from people on the phone? Anybody talking and on mute, maybe? I guess, Ted, what would be your recommended next steps then? Like, you know, apparently you guys done a lot of work on this already, so what would be like your recommendations to move forward?
Okay, that's a fair question, and I said I wasn't going to show any more slides, but I did have this last one on here. So this speaks maybe to this milestone, but also to the activities of the network. And what I would say is that the network itself wasn't paying for any specific product to happen, so everything that you see kind of arose out of what we felt as a group was the most important topic and what was tractable through synthesis. I would say that in our activities we did a lot of the work that we could kind of do for free, and so the way I think of it is that we've identified a bunch of topics, and some of these maps are included here, where if we had sort of additional funding in sort of these small increments, and I'm thinking here sort of one-year postdocs, where you actually put a little bit of money to say, hey, we want a person to make a map of, you know, a gap analysis, that there's a real low-hanging fruit here in that we've laid out everything, but some of these next steps are sort of just beyond what someone can do in their spare time without a specific project. And so I guess it's sort of a pitch to program managers to think about sort of beyond writing 15-page proposals, whether there's a place for, you know, sort of small amounts of, you know, 6 months or 1 year postdoc funding where you could direct it to whichever lab is making the most progress and can come up with a product in that time period. And so I think the network's been able to identify those activities, and then I think sort of the thinking back to sort of the funding community is just whether there are ways for that to happen that could really push some of these products towards, you know, completion. So I don't know if that answered your question, Carl. I think the next steps, a lot of them, you sort of saw them with the maps. They're not all finished and published or, you know, have all the data in them, but they're just very close and can use a final push. So that's my answer to that.
Okay. Any comments from others on the phone?
This is Eric. Ted, has there been any discussion about pushing the synthesis out towards more stakeholder-related products? In other words, combining vulnerability with infrastructural needs or so forth?
Yeah, so Eric, that's a good question. And who I would say the stakeholders we have been targeting are right now people thinking about global climate change. So within the search program and the Permafrost Action Team, there for sure is a interest in local impacts, and I would put infrastructure into that. What we've been doing so far is making this information available at sort of the policy level, so State Department thinking about climate negotiation treaties. And so I sort of skipped over the things that we've done in that realm, but that's been essentially the knowledge to action part that we've been targeting. In the future, I could imagine that also being impacts in the permafrost zone, if you think about a topic like infrastructure, which you just mentioned. But this work on carbon really is thinking about how the Arctic influences the global carbon cycle and the climate system. And so most of those decision makers and policy people are Washington-based.
Yep, thanks.
Anything else for Ted? Okay.
Hi. This is a bit of a side comment. I guess some of you who know me know that I'm working, helping to co-organize the Arctic Observing Summit, which will take place in Fairbanks next March in conjunction with the Arctic Science Summit Week. We're actually inviting white papers and poster presentations. And so we have these themes that have already sort of been pre-selected based on feedback from previous summits. But I think this would be a really wonderful component to add to our discussions. And so I will go ahead and actually post the information here on the website for everybody. But if you may want to consider that, if you have a synthesis product that you have in the making at the moment, or that it's potentially accessible to non-experts, this would be a really wonderful topic. So I just encourage you to maybe talk about it amongst your colleagues. Thank you, and I'll post the information.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great idea. Ted, do you think that's possible?
Yeah, for sure the Arctic Observing Summit is on my radar next March, right? And so, yes, I think depending on exactly what you had in mind, I certainly think there's components of this that would be helpful to that meeting.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you so much. Thank you.
Okay, since we're getting real short on time, I think we're going to end the discussion for now. So thanks, Ted. I really appreciate it. It looks like you've really done a lot of work with you and your colleagues. So I think this is a really good start for this milestone. And I really appreciate
Carl,
it.
this is Sarah. Could I ask one additional question?
Sure.
So, thanks. So, Ted, I see that under the rationale you have mentioned NG Arctic and CARV and above. So what has been your interaction with those large programs?
That's a complicated question, Sarah. Let me give it a nutshell, which is, I mean, each of those projects is different, and I've interacted closely with each of them, so I'm not an unbiased observer of them. I mean, the whole while as a project like NG Arctic has gotten going, I've looked at the Permafrost Carbon Network as starting the important databases that need to be there, and I see that these new programs are going to be generating new primary data, and they can go, some of those data can go right into these databases that we've created, and so I think we have this platform now to really integrate all these new observations more quickly than we did the first time around. That being said, you know, the more people working on it, the harder it is to coordinate, but I'll just pitch something that's coming up at AGU this year. We do a Permafrost Carbon Network session, so we usually have 2 or 3 oral sessions because we get a lot of abstracts to that, and then AGU came back to us asking if we wanted to do a session that was something different than the 15-minute talks that we're also familiar with, and so we proposed to them that we'd have a panel that included the Permafrost Carbon Network, included CARV, NG Arctic, above, sort of the leads of all those people thinking about, and really sort of a discussion with the community of how to link all the new information that's going to be coming out. So maybe we'll have an answer from out of that for you in terms of how to integrate across these big projects, but it's definitely an ongoing topic. Thanks.
Thanks. That's really helpful to know. Thanks.
Okay.